In the winter of 1867, a man named Charles Delony stood on the frozen banks of the Green River in Wyoming Territory and made a calculation. The Union Pacific Railroad was pushing west toward its meeting with the Central Pacific. Every mile of track required 3,000 wooden ties. The Transcontinental Railroad would need millions of them. Delony contracted with the Union Pacific to supply ties to the railhead in Green River City. He hired 30 men to spend the winter in the mountains. Their job was simple: cut trees, shape them into ties, stack them near the river, wait for spring. When the snow melted and the river rose, they'd float the ties downstream, over 100 miles through mountain canyons to where the railroad crews waited. It was brutal work, dangerous work, lonely work, but it was also the beginning of an industry that would define Wyoming for the next 80 years. This is the story of the tie hack, the men who spent months alone in frozen mountain camps cutting railroad ties by hand, one swing of the broadax at a time, 25 ties a day, every day, or you didn't eat. Because in the tie hacking business, you got paid by the piece, not by the hour, not by the day, by the tie. Between 1867 and the 1940s, Wyoming became the principal source of railroad ties in the United States. 4 major regions produced them. The Medicine Bow Mountains supplied the Union Pacific. The Bighorn Mountains provided ties for the Burlington System in Northern Pacific. The Upper Green River fed the Union Pacific. And the Wind River Range supplied the Chicago and Northwestern Railway. The scale was staggering. The Wyoming Tie and Timber Company alone produced over 10 million ties between 1914 and 1946. Across all 4 regions, tens of millions more. To understand why, you need to understand what a railroad tie actually is. A tie is a rectangular wooden beam that sits perpendicular to the rails, supporting them and keeping them spaced at the correct gauge. The ties distribute the weight of passing trains across the ballast, the crushed rock bed beneath the track. Without ties, rails sink into the ground, the gauge shifts, trains derail. Every mile of track requires approximately 3,000 ties. They wear out, they rot, they crack, they need constant replacement. During the railroad boom of the late 1800s and early 1900s, America's railroads consumed ties faster than any other natural resource except coal. The specifications were exact: 8 feet long, 7 inches wide, 7 inches deep. The railroad wouldn't accept anything less. The ideal tree was about 11 inches in diameter at chest height. A 16-inch tree could yield as many as 6 ties if you were skilled enough to get them out without waste. The wood had to be straight-grained lodgepole pine or Engelmann spruce, dense enough to hold spikes, durable enough to last years under constant pressure and weather, and someone had to go into the mountains in the dead of winter and cut them, one at a time, by hand. That someone was called a tie hack. The term hack comes from the tool, the broadax used to shape the rough log into a finished tie. These weren't lumberjacks clear-cutting forests. They were specialized craftsmen who could look at a standing tree and know exactly how many ties it would yield. Most tie hacks were Scandinavian immigrants: Swedes, Norwegians, Finns, Danes. Some were German, some were Austrian. A few were Civil War veterans looking for work. After 1900, French Canadians joined them. They came to America looking for opportunity. What they found was winter isolation in the Wyoming mountains, working for piece-rate wages that could either make them decent money or leave them broke, depending entirely on how fast they could swing an axe. The system worked like this. A timber company would contract with a railroad to supply a certain number of ties. The company would establish a camp in the mountains near suitable timber and running water. Then they'd recruit tie hacks, usually through word of mouth or newspaper advertisements targeting Scandinavian communities in the Midwest. Each tie hack was assigned a strip of timber about 200 feet wide and up to half a mile long. That was his territory for the season. Everything in that strip belonged to him. Every tree, every tie. The company provided basic tools: a felling saw, a double-bit axe, a broadax, a measuring stick, and a spud peeler for removing bark. The tie hack provided the skill, and it required considerable skill. First, you selected your tree. You couldn't just cut anything. It had to meet railroad specifications. You eyeballed the trunk, calculating how straight it was, whether the grain ran true, how many ties you'd get from it. Then you cut it down. If you were working alone, you used a one-man crosscut saw. More often, two men worked together with a two-man saw, one on each end, pulling in rhythm. The saw was sharp enough to cut through an 11-inch tree in under 10 minutes if both men knew what they were doing. Once the tree was down, you trimmed the branches with the double-bit axe. Then, you measured the trunk, marking off 8-foot sections. Each section would become one tie. You cut the trunk into those 8-foot lengths with the cross-cut saw. Now, you had rough logs. Here's where the real skill came in. You took the double-bit axe and scored the two horizontal sides of the log, making shallow cuts every few inches along the length. This was called scoring. It broke the wood fibers and made the next step easier. Then, you picked up the broadax. A broadax isn't like a regular axe. It's massive, sometimes weighing 12 pounds or more. The head is broad and flat on one side, beveled on the other. It's designed for one purpose, shaping wood. You stood over the log and swung that broadax down, following the scored lines. Each swing removed a chunk of wood. Slowly, methodically, you flattened one side of the log until it was smooth and level. Then you rolled the log over, scored the opposite side, flattened it with the broadax. Now you had a log with two flat sides parallel to each other, 7 inches apart. You rolled it 90 degrees, scored the third side, flattened it, rolled it again, final side, scored, flattened. When you were done, you had a rectangular beam 8 feet long, 7 inches wide, 7 inches deep. That was one tie. An experienced tie hack could produce 25 to 30 ties in a day. Some exceptional workers cut more. Records suggest one competition in 1903 where a young cook promised to marry the man who could cut the most ties in a day, though history doesn't record who won or whether the marriage happened. But producing 30 ties meant 10 to 12 hours of continuous physical labor, swinging a 12-pound broadaxe hundreds of times, hauling logs, measuring, cutting, shaping, in winter in the Wyoming mountains, where temperatures regularly dropped below zero. The pay structure made the work even more brutal. Tie hacks weren't paid by the hour, they were paid per tie. The rate fluctuated between 7 cents and 25 cents per tie, depending on the year, the quality grade, and the railroad's current needs. Let's do the math. At 15 cents per tie, a common rate, cutting 25 ties earned you $3.75 for the day. That's roughly $140 in today's money. Sounds reasonable until you consider the expenses. The company commissary charged for everything: food, tobacco, tools, replacement axe handles, even the kerosene for your lamp. These costs came out of your earnings, and you only got paid when your ties passed inspection. The railroad graded every tie. A Class 1 tie, the highest quality, had to be perfectly straight, properly sized with at least 5 inches of level debarked surface on two sides. Anything less got downgraded or rejected entirely. If you cut 30 ties but 10 of them failed inspection, you only got paid for 20. If you injured yourself and couldn't work, no ties cut, no pay. If a storm trapped you in your cabin for 3 days, no ties cut, no pay. The piece rate system meant your income depended entirely on productivity. Fast workers made decent money. Slow workers, or unlucky ones, barely survived. This created a psychological pressure that was almost as brutal as the physical labor. You couldn't afford to rest. You couldn't afford to be sick. You couldn't afford to make mistakes. Every morning you woke up in your cabin knowing that your survival depended on how many times you could swing that broadaxe before dark. The work camps themselves ranged from primitive to surprisingly elaborate. In the earliest days, a tie hack might build his own cabin, a simple log structure, maybe 12 by 14 feet with a dirt floor and a stone fireplace. No windows, one door, A bed made from pine boughs, a table, a stool. That was home for 4 to 6 months. As the industry matured, timber companies established larger camps. By the early 1900s, some camps housed 300 people, not just tie hacks, but support staff, families, even children. These camps became small mountain villages. They had commissaries that sold food and supplies, office buildings where the company managers worked, boarding houses for unmarried men, separate cabins for families, barns for horses, cookhouses that fed the crews, blacksmith shops for repairing tools and shoeing horses, even sawmills, meat houses, privies, and root cellars for storing vegetables. Some camps had schools for children. They held dances, weddings, ski trips for recreation when the snow was good. But many tie hacks still worked alone or in pairs, living in isolated cabins deep in the forest, miles from the main camp. These men went weeks without seeing another human being. The isolation was profound. You'd wake before dawn in a cabin so cold you could see your breath. The fire in the stone hearth had died during the night. You'd rebuild it, hands numb, breaking kindling, coaxing flame. The wood was often frozen solid. Your fingers ached from the cold as you worked the flint and steel, trying to catch a spark. The cabin itself offered minimal protection. Wind whistled through gaps between the logs. Snow drifted through cracks in the walls. On the worst nights, you'd wake to find frost coating the inside of the door. Breakfast was coffee, thick, bitter, strong enough to strip paint, and whatever you had. Beans, salt pork, biscuits if you'd baked them the night before. Most tie hacks ate the same meal every morning for months. Variety was a luxury. You ate quickly. Daylight was precious. In the deep winter, you had maybe 8 hours of usable light. Every minute mattered. Then you walked to your strip of timber, maybe half a mile, maybe more, through snow that could be waist deep, wearing boots wrapped in canvas or burlap for extra warmth because proper winter boots were expensive and wore out quickly. The walk itself was exhausting. Breaking trail through fresh snow, watching for wildlife, carrying your tools. The broadax alone weighed 12 pounds. You worked until you couldn't see anymore. Your breath froze in your beard. Your fingers went numb inside your gloves. But you kept swinging the axe because every tie meant money, and money meant survival. Then you walked back to your cabin in the dark. The temperature dropped fast after sunset. 20 below, 30 below, sometimes colder. Dinner was the same as breakfast: beans, salt pork, coffee. You ate by lamplight, alone, listening to the wind outside. You sharpened your tools by that same lamplight. The broadax had to be razor sharp or it wouldn't cut clean. You used a whetstone, running it along the blade edge in long, rhythmic strokes. The scrape of stone on steel, over and over, it was one of the few sounds you'd hear all day. Then you slept, usually 4 to 6 hours. Your body needed more, but the work didn't allow it, and woke the next morning to do it again. Days blurred together, the same routine, the same labor, the same cold, the same solitude. Some tie hacks marked the days by carving notches in a stick. Others lost track entirely. Some men went a little crazy from the isolation. They talked to themselves, talked to the trees, sang songs to break the silence. Others drank. The tie camp commissaries didn't sell alcohol. This was often during Prohibition. But that didn't stop anyone. Some tie hacks made their own moonshine using dried fruit boiled in a pressure cooker hooked up to copper tubing as a condenser. Prune-based moonshine could have unfortunate laxative effects. Others drank vanilla extract, which contained alcohol, straight from the bottle. One tie hack from the late 1930s recalled that the camp commissary sold more vanilla extract than all the rest of the county combined. The physical dangers were constant. A slip with the broadax could sever an artery. Men bled to death in remote cabins, too far from help. Falling trees crushed workers. A widowmaker, a dead branch lodged high in a tree, could drop without warning and kill you instantly. Frostbite was common. Fingers, toes, ears, noses. The cold was relentless, and once frostbite set in, there was no good treatment. You either lost the frozen flesh or you didn't. Accidents with the crosscut saw were frequent. The blade could bind in the wood and snap back. One worker had his boot pinned to a tie when a log rolled unexpectedly. And then there were the river drives. All winter long, you cut ties and stacked them near the riverbank. The ties were decked, stacked with the butt ends facing the river in piles 15 or 20 feet high, side by side, stretching along the bank for miles. You marked each tie with your personal symbol, a notch, a brand, a specific cut pattern. That's how you got paid. When the ties reached the sorting yard, inspectors would count how many bore your mark and grade them for quality. When spring came and the snow melted, the river would swell with runoff. The water rose fast. Creeks became torrents. The main river channels swelled to twice their normal width. The current ran fast and cold, carrying snowmelt from the high country. That's when the tie drive began. Men called river rats, specialists who knew the rivers, would arrive at the stacked ties. These weren't the tie hacks who cut the wood. These were different men, younger usually, willing to wade into ice-cold water for weeks at a time. Some were college students working summer jobs. Some were ranchers earning extra income. Some were Native Americans from local reservations. They'd push the ties into the current, hundreds of thousands of ties all at once. The ties would tumble into the river like dominoes, creating massive log jams that stretched for miles upstream. Breaking those jams was the most dangerous part of the job. A river rat would wade out onto the jam, walking on floating logs that shifted unpredictably beneath his boots. He'd use his pike pole to find the key log, the one log holding the others in place. Pull that log free, and the entire jam would suddenly explode into motion. You had seconds to get clear. If you didn't, thousands of ties would sweep over you. Men drowned. Men were crushed. One account mentions a worker whose boot got pinned to a tie. His partners barely freed him before the whole mass shifted. The river rats waded into ice-cold water, often ankle-deep in silt, working to keep the ties moving. They used long poles with hooks called pike poles to break up jams, steer ties away from rocks and islands, and keep the flow steady downstream. Some sections of river were particularly treacherous. Fish Canyon had notorious jams that required special crews to break them up. Rocks lurked just below the surface, ready to snag ties and create new jams. Cottonwood snags, dead trees fallen across the current, caught ties by the hundreds. It was backbreaking work, dangerous work. The river could sweep you away. Ties could pin you underwater. Hypothermia was a constant threat. Your clothes were wet from dawn to dusk. Your boots squelched with every step. At night, you'd try to dry them by the fire, but they'd never fully dry before morning. The drives could take weeks. The crew followed the ties downstream, setting up camp each night. A drive cook and assistants, called flunkies, prepared massive meals. T-bone steaks when they could get them, beans and bread baked in Dutch ovens when they couldn't. Fresh-caught trout from the river, potatoes, onions. The food was simple but plentiful. The companies knew that hungry men worked slower. Teepee tents sheltered 2 men each. You'd collapse into your bedroll exhausted, listening to the roar of the river and the clatter of ties bumping together as they floated past in the darkness. Wagons and later trucks hauled supplies and kept pace with the drive. The cook would ride ahead each day to set up the next camp, starting fires, preparing meals, so everything was ready when the river rats arrived after sundown. The ties traveled over 100 miles, through mountain canyons, over rapids, around bends. When they finally reached the collection point, often near a town like Green River or Riverton, another log and cable boom caught them. From there, the ties were sorted, graded, and shipped by rail to construction sites across the country. Thousands of ties, representing months of labor by dozens of men, all to keep America's railroads running. The industry peaked during World War I, when railroads were critical for transporting troops and supplies. Tie demand skyrocketed. Companies expanded operations, new camps opened, production increased. After the war, mechanization began to change everything. Portable sawmills replaced some hand cutting by the late 1920s. Trucks started transporting ties instead of floating them downstream. By 1929, some camps had cabins built on wheels so they could be moved behind trucks from site to site, the first mobile homes. The last major tie cutting operation in the Bighorn National Forest started in 1925. It ended around 1933. The Wyoming Tie and Timber Company, which had dominated the Wind River region since the early 1900s, produced its final ties in the mid-1940s. The company was sold in 1947. The reign of the Knights of the Broadax was over. Today, 32 tie hacks lie buried in a special plot in the Riverton Cemetery. A hand-hewn tie stands as their memorial. The plaque reads, "Erected to perpetuate the memory of the hardy woods and rivermen who made and delivered the cross ties for the building and maintenance of the Chicago and Northwestern Railway in the Western Country." On Togwotee Pass, 12 miles west of Dubois, the Tie Hack Memorial stands on a high bluff overlooking the Wind River. It honors the men who spent their lives in those frozen mountains, cutting ties one swing at a time. Scattered throughout Wyoming's forests, you can still find the remains of tie hack cabins, log structures slowly returning to the earth, stone hearths, rusted tools, evidence of lives lived in isolation and hardship. The tie hacking era lasted less than a century, but it produced an estimated 10 million ties from Wyoming alone. Those ties built the infrastructure that connected the nation. They carried trains that transported soldiers, goods, settlers, and dreams westward. And they were created by men whose names we barely remember. Scandinavian immigrants, young men seeking opportunity, hard workers willing to spend winter alone in the mountains, swinging a broadax for piece-rate wages. 8 feet long, 7 inches wide, 7 inches deep. That was the job. That was the life. And for nearly 80 years, that's how America got its railroad ties. One hack at a time.